Hey, everybody. Good to have you back. I'm excited to introduce the podcast tonight with Nathan Monk. Nathan Monk is an author, human rights activist, and a former priest who stepped down in order to love and help others do the same. We had a really great conversation with Nathan the other night. My buddy Daniel was here on the conversation as well. We covered a wide range of topics, but I think the most exciting thing about this podcast was finally hearing Father Nathan tell his entire story from beginning to the present. It was a really good conversation. It got emotional towards the end. There's some great content here, and I hope you enjoy. All right, in 3, 2, 1, we're live. Nathan, thank you for coming in tonight.
Hey, thank you for having me. I'm really excited about it.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate the time, and I'm sure there's a few people who don't know your reputation at least quite as much as we do here locally, because I know that you and I think we first shook hands probably in 2010 because I was out taking pictures one night with my friend Daniel Miller, and he made a point to go over and say hello to you because you were at Plaza Ferdinand.
Oh yeah, I
night.
remember this.
Yeah, we had a photographers meetup, and you were there. I think you had your Feed the Poor sign close at hand, and you were talking with some people on the benches.
I remember because Daniel shot a photo of
Yes.
me there and sent it to me on Facebook.
I remember that picture because I thought it was a really cool view. It was like the street lights behind you, and you were in your cassock. It was really cool. But I think that was the first time we shook hands, and I've kind of, as much as I could, watch your progress since then and everything you've been doing in Pensacola and further afield. And we ran into each other, I think, in February at the Fish House.
Mm-hmm.
You were picking up food. I was there with some friends, and you suggested that we should get a drink together sometime or something. And I've been looking forward to having some kind of conversation with you ever since. So it really does mean a lot that you're here tonight. So
well, I'm excited about it. Better to have the conversation recorded. That's the new wave of the world. So
yeah, it's either the new wave or it's the height of narcissism. We'll figure out later.
well, this way, I can pull a Comey if you do anything wrong. I've got proof. So
okay, and that took us under 2 minutes to get there. I'm proud of that. The last person I talked to didn't want to talk politics at all.
oh, I ooze politics. I can't help it. So.
Well, you're dealing with a crazy libertarian, so I'm open to hearing anything at this point because it's a weird time to be an American.
Absolutely.
But before we get too deep into the weeds on that, for the three people who won't have heard from you in some way, could you kind of outline what your life has been like? Because I know that you did some acting for a while, then you were in the priesthood, then you had a very notable exit from the priesthood surrounding some very important topics, and then since then you've been involved in a whole bunch of things. So what made Nathan Monk as we see him today? I've always been curious just for myself.
Well, I think that when I think back on my earlier years of my life, and people, it's so funny because I've had conversations about myself with people before where they didn't know that they were talking about me, because people think of my life sort of in these sort of harsh segments. Mm-hmm. And so I was at a bar one time, and this guy was like, he said to me, he's like, you kind of look like that guy that stands up there and holds that sign by the street. Man, that guy's just a real piece of work. I was like, tell me about that. We sat there and just had this whole conversation. Because I have sort of been involved in a number of very lightning rod topics over the years. And it was interesting, when I left the priesthood, that sort of became, because of the subject matter and because it was so sort of this bombastic event and had all of this fallout and whatever, a lot of people had asked me, to sort of chronicle that, write a book about it or something. And when I sat down to do that, I realized that I couldn't explain my life or how I got there without really delving into my past and my childhood, which is a subject that I, for a very long time, hadn't really addressed publicly. And what I came to the conclusion of was because of my work with the poor, which is probably one of the more defining aspects of my life, my adult life. that was 100% motivated by my own upbringing and things that I experienced in my youth. My family, I was born in DeRidder, Louisiana, which is this just, sort of forgettable outskirt town of Shreveport. And the thing about growing up there or living there, I was there until I was about 3, and my dad was an assistant pastor at the time, I think, of music at this little Baptist church, and everything was just sort of quaint. And my dad had lived this huge, big life before me and my siblings came along, and had traveled the globe with musical groups in the 70s, and had just done anything and everything. And then he just had this sort of small recording studio above our little house that he and my grandfather built, and everything was just typical and quaint, I mean, it was, and then he just got the bug to move to Nashville and really delve in deeper to his music career. And to hear my parents tell the story now, I mean, essentially my dad got sick on the way into Nashville and lost his voice. And it was like this sort of omen of everything that was about to come. And just for my dad in those years, it was just nothing really stuck, and everything that he tried to do would sort of start with this feeling of success, whether it was musically, or he opened up an antique store, bought a franchise book business, and all that, and it was like every thing that he tried, every project that he delved into, was absorbing the loss of the previous adventure, and I guess it just sort of all caught up with them eventually in my very early teenagerhood. And it was a pretty turbulent time for me, because right around the time that everything sort of hit the fan, I was diagnosed with dyslexia. And at the time, 20 something years ago, that was not as well understood as it is now. And my mother had been homeschooling me, and there was a lot of pressure on her to put me into the public school system for me to, get, I guess, specialized help and all this kind of stuff. And then they ended up putting me in special ed, and so it was like, which was a totally different system. Back then it was me and like 6 other kids, and you had a kid literally sitting in the corner thinking he was going to be able to erase his skin off with his eraser, and tried and cut himself and all this, and it was like, it was just all of that was going on, and my home life was completely falling apart, and so here I was, sort of being stigmatized because of this disability, and having to come to terms with the fact that, I'm not any better than the kid who's trying to erase his skin off. Like, he's also dealing with this neurological thing in his brain that's making him feel this way, just like I have something neurological in my brain that's, making certain things, impossible for me. And so I was sort of dealing with, at like 11, 12 years old, with that existential crisis. And then my family, we lived in this just absolutely beautiful log cabin on the top of this little hill with a creek in the front, and we used to go ride horses and just live this perfect, picturesque Tennessee life, And then my parents sold that house, and everything just incrementally kept getting worse. And
did your father ever get his voice back, or was that?
Yeah, I mean, he was able to sing again, but it was just something was off, and it wasn't with his voice. I think it was just one of those things where he hit the party right as everyone was already ready to go home, kind of thing, you know. And by that point, you know, a lot of the people that had moved to Nashville during the first wave of this like contemporary Christian music boom were already passing on the baton to their children, you know, and the whole music industry had just evolved and changed, and nothing was the same. And so we started renting again, and then, you know, it was obvious that my dad wasn't making all the payments, and he was having a hard time keeping everything afloat. And next thing we knew, I mean, we were bouncing back and forth in hotels and sleeping in the car and then sleeping at friends' houses, and then sometimes we were coming down to Pensacola to visit my grandmother and staying there for extended periods of time, you know. And it took a while for me to kind of piece all of that together and realize we don't have a house. We don't have a place that is ours, you know. And it was like, and I remember that sort of dawning on me in my mid-teens, and being like, there is something not normal about this situation. I remember, you know, the first time a police officer showed up at the motel that we were staying in, and just, you know, open up, it's the police, and opening up that door, and the, you know, motel owners, you know, screaming for us to get out, and all this kind of just traumatic and scary. And you know, I grew up initially, I mean, the first phase of my life is the sort of picturesque definition of everything that is white privilege, right? You know, I mean, I was living this just
pure Americana,
right? I mean, it was everything that you know, the average television show is, teen melodrama is about, and then it just wasn't, and it was just crashing into this cliff face, and not knowing, you know, I had never had any reason to distrust the police, right? I mean, I did not grow up in a world where I was taught that, and then here it was, you know, long arm of the law, drug dealers, right down the way in this motel, dealing drugs, you know, trafficking prostitutes and all this kind of stuff. But by God, the mother of five who's late on, you know, the $30 hotel bill is what must be certainly receiving the full extension of justice in this moment, you know. And that's just a really big thing to grapple with, you know, as what you were taught to believe, sort of this mythos of the American dream crashing into the American reality was a huge thing to have to come to terms with. And
how old were you at this time? Like, you said approaching your teens.
Yeah, I mean, I was probably like, I would have been about 14 or 15 at this time. And so
you're right in that formative sweet spot where everything's enlarged.
And you know, what was weird is, I mean, we were still going to church and doing all of this sort of normal social stuff, and no one knew what we were going through, or very limited people knew what we were going through. And so I was sort of keeping up this facade. I mean, my girlfriend at the time didn't know what we were going through. I didn't talk with her about those types of things. And so it was just sort of this huge struggle of being taught to lie, you know, of keeping up these appearances, which again brings off this whole other thing of, you know, of we were this hugely moralistic church-going family, you know, pastor's kid and all this kinds of stuff growing up, and then, you know, but we're also supposed to keep this, you know, huge secret of what we were going through. And you know, I don't remember anyone sitting me down and saying, you must lie about this, but there's this stigma that comes with it, that it almost just becomes instinctual because you're living now outside of the social norm. And so everyone wants to be loved and liked and popular and cared about and whatever. And so, we hide our differences in this attempt to fit into that mold. And so, it was interesting now, decades later, that girl that I dated way back when, her and I have sort of reconnected through social media, and I sent her a copy of my book, and she read it, and she wrote me back, and she's like, I just had no idea. I had no idea the things that you were going through.
And that's become its own trope in a lot of ways, like those people in the church who give off this pretense of complete normalcy, complete being fine, but then there's like a whole storm going on under the surface.
Absolutely.
Have you seen or heard of the film Henry Gamble's Birthday Party?
I have heard of it, but I haven't seen it.
So a good friend of mine who lives up in New York City. Yeah, Danny, you mind pulling this up?
I got that.
Thank you. A good friend of mine up in New York City, his name is Josh Insinius. He was a groomsman at my wedding. Great dude. He runs a site called Film Party where he reviews movies, and he's really good at honing in on independent directors who are up and coming. And he sent me this one film, like he had the Vimeo link from the director for the festivals that he forwarded to me. And it's a movie that deals with exactly that. It's the son of a pastor. He's gay, doesn't know how to talk about it.
Right.
Both parents have these things going on.
I mean, the short description is Henry Gamble, a 17-year-old preacher's son, wrestles with sexuality, alcoholism, and faith during his birthday party.
And
that's a lot of
Sure.
a lot of things at once.
Yeah.
So,
I can only imagine.
And I bring it up because I'll send you the link if you want.
I'd love to see
it's so worth watching because it deals with, and I grew up homeschooled in a very conservative environment, and I saw literally every person I grew up with was in this movie. It was so true to life and so spot on, and it blows me away how it's taken us this long to actually confront this, like, for lack of a better term, a systemic dishonesty within the church. I mean, coming back to what you were saying, like your family's going through all of this, and the place that should be your safety net is the same place where you're telling the biggest lie.
Right.
It blows me away how that still happens.
Well, and the church that we were going to at the time, I started homeschooling again during that time of homelessness because we were bouncing around, and it was easier to not get the system involved if we were not part of the system, and so what was so fascinating about that is the church that we were going to had a homeschool supplementary program where you could kind of like go to some of the classes that your parents weren't that good at, teaching or whatever. So they had supplementary math classes, English classes, whatever. And so I participated in that program. And that church was very, very conservative in its views on, like, human sexuality and all this kind of stuff. And I just remember so many of my friends genuinely falling into depression over the fact that they couldn't live up to those types of standards and making so many, I won't even call them mistakes. That's something that they want me to say, but they made choices. They made their own choices and then dealt with tremendous, gut-wrenching guilt over these choices and making all these loopholes to get around the rules and all this stuff. Right. And it's like, when in reality, all they were wanting to be is a damn teenager doing teenager stuff, And so going through all of those things, all at the same time, dealing with my dyslexia and dealing with the poverty and the homelessness and the bouncing around and the parents fighting and all of that. And it was just very confusing and frustrating, and I ended up finding an outlet in acting. And because then I didn't have to be myself. I just got to go play pretend. And so I got involved in theater at this supplementary school program that I was involved in. They had a theater program And I got involved in that. And this talent agent came to a showcase that we did and came up to me afterwards and said, hey, listen, I really liked what you did. I would love you to come by. I'll give you, we'll get you headshots. We'll do all this stuff. So I did. So I started doing, commercials and music videos and all this kinds of stuff. I turned 16 on the set of a film that this made-for-TV horrible movie that I will not say the name of, and no one can make me do it. And
Daniel, where's that whiskey?
Yeah, right. Yeah, I used a stage name. So the best part was that I went through this whole process while we were living in a dilapidated house that was uninhabitable.
Oh, wow.
That and I only got paid $500 total to do this movie, which was felt like a lot at the time, especially being impoverished. But my dad had found this house, dilapidated, falling apart, flea infested dive that people should not have been living in, and he made some arrangement with the landowners that we could stay in it for like $1 a year to essentially be watchdogs of this massive multiple acre property that they had up for sale.
It was still in Tennessee.
It's still in Tennessee.
Okay.
And so got us out of the hotels and whatever for a little while for us to then be, in just this weird situation. And that's when my third sister was born, was in while we were living in that house. And then the property sold, or something happened that ended up getting us kicked out of there, and then there we were right back into the motel, sleeping in the car, bouncing friend's house life, and it was just such a weird juxtaposition to be living in, that on any given day I could be sitting on a film set for name your favorite country music star, and literally hanging out with Garth Brooks, and then leaving and going and staying in a motel, and it was just such a weird, but I found solace in that. And so my mom left my dad on my 17th birthday party. The day after my 17th birthday party, she left and came to Pensacola to live with my grandmother. And that was when our families slowly made their migration down to this area, was that my mom came down here. My dad followed a few months later. I stayed in Nashville. And then a series of really upsetting events led to my dad bringing me down here. And then I left right after my 18th birthday and moved back to Nashville and lived up there for a while, just trying to figure out what I was going to do. And it was sort of during that finally being free period, because I reached a point where right before I turned 18, or right after that, I just wanted to kill myself. And I don't mean that in a glib way. I mean very genuinely, knife blade to the wrist, was ready to just exit, because I just was so miserable with how life was.
I was curious about that, like separate from your family, going back to Nashville, for any period of time, did you like carve out any sort of routine or stability for yourself, or did you kind of keep living a gypsy lifestyle, just living in different places while in between jobs? Did you have any of that on your own, or
once I got out on my own, I actually I went and started working at a print factory in Nashville when I was 18 years old, making very good money for the time, and I rented my own place and lived on my own in silence for the first time in in my entire life, you know, and I didn't have the responsibility of watching out for siblings or dealing with any of this drama, you know, and it was just a very peaceful experience. I lived in this sort of artistic, you know, community of just the weird, eclectic other side of Nashville with up and coming artists and musicians and whatever. And it was just a really refreshing experience to go through, to wake up every morning and go and work really hard and then be able to go out and play really hard and just be, you know.
Yeah.
And I felt like in a certain way that it gave me that sort of the tail end of my teenagerhood, that opportunity to live some of the experience that I wasn't able to live once I was sort of free from the storm that was happening around me. And it was a very healing time for me.
But at the end of it, you still became a little bit on the depressed side, and
you
used the term miserable. But
no, that was right before I came to Pensacola at 17.
Okay.
And it was at the end of that turning 18 that was when I was like, I'm just done. And that's when I literally took every opportunity to kill myself, and then had this moment of clarity, and I was like, well, I could kill myself, or I could get the hell out of this town, get away from my family, and just do myself and be.
So that was your impetus for going back
Right,
to Nashville.
yeah.
They didn't have. Okay, I misunderstood.
Yeah.
I thought you meant you got back there and still couldn't.
No. When I got back there, I got right back involved in acting. Got a great job, like steady day job, and just you know, it was really, really good. And I was there for quite a while, and I loved it, and reconnected with friends, and just kind of went through this whole thing. I came down and visited family here in Pensacola when I had the chance. One time in between jobs, I went on this little walkabout. I parked my car here in Pensacola and just walked from Pensacola to Nashville.
Wow.
It took a month and a half, and just journeyed my way up there, and slept outside and slept on church doorsteps, and even in men's shelters, and all this kind of you know, just did the whole thing. And just, that was really what opened my eyes to the other side of homelessness, because my experience with homelessness was family homelessness, which is a totally different animal to what the chronic male population have. Family homelessness, though it makes up staggering numbers, is an invisible problem in our country, because parents are so protective of the fact that they don't want their children taken, and they don't want whatever. And so it's all secret, which is sort of this opposite end of, you know, we see the chronic homeless sleeping on the streets and holding signs and all, and it's this visible thing. And so, when in reality it's kind of like this little tip of the iceberg that makes up the total of poverty and homelessness in America. Right. And so we end up spending, you know, tremendous amounts of energy screaming about the homeless guy holding a sign begging for money, when we've got kids who are being literally kidnapped and trafficked out of hotels in Orlando, because they know that nobody's going to care about the little homeless kid that got snatched up while they're not even enrolled in public school. So, you know, it's this weird other world that exists under, like you said earlier, that lies up underneath swept under the carpet of the American dream.
Yeah. It's like, it's not Norman Rockwell, it's Dorian Gray.
Right.
Yeah. So acting in Nashville, and then when I first heard of you and met you, you were in Priest Rose back in Pensacola. So how did that happen?
Yeah, so that was weird. So the story there is, I made a free will choice finally to move back to Pensacola. And my early 20s, my siblings were getting older, finishing up high school. My parents had completely stabilized by that point. Both had good jobs, house. Life had kind of gone back to what it had been. And so like my youngest sister, who was born in that dilapidated little house, she never grew up in that world. She never experienced the horrors that me and my other siblings had grown up seeing. But I wanted to be close to my siblings while they were kind of going through those teenage years, because I knew how difficult it was for me, and I wanted to be here for them. And while I was in Nashville, I was living with some friends and just having a great time, great job, and just loving life. And I was going to church at this, super trendy place that was inside a coffee shop that was inside the old Planet Hollywood. And, we were just so sickeningly relevant and culturally hip and whatever. And I was walking in, and there was this guy sitting outside, and he goes, "Do you got any money?" I was like, "I don't have any money. I'm sorry, buddy." And he's like, "Do you have a cigarette?" I was like, "Yeah." And so I turned around, I gave him a cigarette, and I turned around to go back in to the church, and I looked, and because the church was renting the space from this coffee shop, there was a sign that they had put up, just like they would for any other event, and it said, "Private event." And I just stared there at this sign, "Private event." And I was like, this is a church, And all of a sudden it just had this like massive, like, here's this dude sitting outside, he doesn't feel welcome in there with a bunch of spiky-haired yuppies sitting there gratifying ourselves in the name of the Lord with our hip coffees and bullshitting. And I realized that the line between me and him was real thin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
I was that guy masquerading inside that church, pretending with my frosted tips like I was something different, and I was not. So I made a decision to sit down with this guy, and his name was Bear. We just had this long conversation about life and all this kind of stuff, and I invited him. I was heading down to Pensacola to visit family, and I invited him to come down with me. I said, they just had a hurricane. There's work. If you want to work, there's going to be plenty of stuff to put back together,
About what time was this?
That was Ivan.
Oh, so this was like 2004.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So it was Ivan. And so I brought him down here, and I left. I was just coming for a visit, and I don't know, like 6 months later, I came back down for another visit. I was hanging out in Plaza Ferdinand, and I run into this guy. And he's like, "Hey, you're the dude that brought me down here." And I was like, "I am." I was like, "How's it been going, man?" And he just was like, "Sit down, son." I was like, "Okay," And he just goes on and tells me about the cops messing with him and all these problems, and he couldn't find a job, and just starts unloading all this stuff that he and his buddies were facing. I'm sitting there having this conversation, and this dude comes up and hands me $20 and says, "Hey, buy you and your friend some food." And I was like, all right. So I went and bought food as much as I could afford with $20. I think I got like 16 hamburgers at McDonald's or something like that. Came back, and by that point there were 16 or so guys, 18 guys, whatever it was. I had the exact amount of burgers for the amount of people that were there. And so I just hand out food, and they're like, "Are you ever coming back?" And I was like, "Man, I'll see about it." Around the same time, I started doing that, and it just kind of kept growing. I got arrested for protesting the Bible thumpers.
Over
And-
by Seville?
over by Seville.
Okay.
I was.
I've had run-ins with them.
Yeah. So my brother was playing a show. There used to be a venue in what I guess is now, what is it called? Top of the Town, I think is what it used to be called, but now it's
Oh, isn't that Bedlam's now?
Bedlam's, yeah.
Yeah.
So it used to be called Top of the Town, and they used to do shows there and stuff like that. My brother was playing there, and I just pulled back into Pensacola during one of my visits, and I had a piece of poster board in my car, and I can't remember what I was doing, but I had a piece of poster board in my car, and so I just wrote "I'm with stupid" on this piece of poster board, and I run over to these Bible thumpers because they were yelling and screaming out in front of Seville, and I'm not there maybe 20 minutes, and a county sheriff's deputy pulls up, and I'm like not smart enough to know that a county deputy isn't supposed to be messing with me in the city. Right. And so he tells me, he's like, you stop harassing these people right now. And I'm like, dude, they are screaming that everyone going in here is whores and going to hell. Like, this is a tit for tat situation as far as I'm concerned. And he was like, I'm telling you right now, if you don't put that sign down, you're going to jail. And I was like, you've got to be kidding me. I have a constitutional, like, I'm on public property.
Right.
Like, I have just as much right to be here as anybody else.
You're holding a sign.
Right.
You're totally within the non-aggression principle.
Sure. And so anyways, he was like, you say one more word, you're going to jail. So that was like saying, are you chicken fly, and so I turned around to him and I put my hands together like this, like in a cuff me motion. I said, does this count?
Oh, wow.
Well, it did. And so my first conversation that I had with my mother back in town was my brother holding his cell phone up to my ear. And my mom was like, are you in town? I was like, I am in town and I need bail money. And so, anyways, that ended up in the papers, and I had sort of snarkily went and bought a priest collar as this jokey screw you to them. So all of a sudden everyone's like, hey, you should start a church. And I was like, I am very rude and have zero intentions of doing anything like that. The food thing starts just taking off. We start having like 150, 200 people meeting in the park. All these volunteers start showing up. And so I don't know what to do. And all these people start looking at me and they're like, you're doing good work. You should start a church. I'm like, the last thing I want to do is start churches. Like, we'll start doing a Bible study like Sunday nights, very low key, just at my house, no big deal. Then and it's not even a Bible study.
Mm-hmm.
We're just going to have a discussion,
Right.
And it just kind of kept growing from there. And this bishop heard about what I was doing, and he writes me. He's like, I've been watching what you're doing, and it seems like you really have a heart, but you need a direction. And I was like, that would be really great, because I have no idea at all what I am doing. This is just sort of this storm happening around me.
And what were you doing at this point? Like apart from what you're doing in the community, like what was your bread and butter while you were here? How were you like?
I was working at a hotel.
Really?
Yeah, like I mean, I was, and raising absolute and utter hell, and all these people were like, where did this guy come from, and what is he doing, and all this stuff, and I was like, I really don't know. I have no plan or agenda whatsoever. It just was happening, and I just sort of kept accidentally, sort of Forrest Gump style, stepping into these weird events, getting arrested and the food distribution was just that some dude gave me $20 because he saw me sitting talking with a homeless guy. I was like, oh, I'll just give this guy $20 and let him continue to give food to homeless people. And the next thing I know, everything just kept sort of expanding. And so this bishop was involved with a group known as the Old Catholic Church, which was a branch off of the Roman Catholic Church. They had a big disagreement in the 1800s over the infallibility of the Pope. And so I just started talking with this bishop and went through their pastoral training program and was ordained.
Wow.
And, I mean, it took time, but
Well,
I'm jumping ahead. And so that was how I became a priest, was that it just happened. It was not the plan. It wasn't what I thought I was going to do with my life. It was that I was a smartass and it caught up with me.
So by the time you got a conversation from a bishop, you realized you were at the top of the roller coaster and you were coming down?
Well, I think when the bishop, I realized that I had a fundamental responsibility to the fact that, like it or not, people were showing up. Mm-hmm. And people were hurting, and they were hurting in a very similar way to that I had been hurt by the church. And I realized I had an opportunity to create an environment where maybe it would be different.
Yeah.
And I think what I learned from that experience, because there was a sort of fracturing that happened within the Old Catholic movement, and a bunch of my buddies all went into the Eastern Orthodox Church, which is what I ultimately ended up doing as well. And so I went from this sort of illegitimate rogue to a priest in the Holy Russian Orthodox Church. And that'll mess with your head.
That was actually my next question, was that flip from being an actor in Nashville, coming back here, kind of, for lack of a better term, being an activist in the community.
Sure.
Just pissing off people to get your point
right
in front of people. I mean, you ended up in Russian Orthodoxy.
Sure.
Now, for the literally the uninitiated, and I would count myself among them, what is the doctrinal statement of the Russian Orthodox Church, especially as it appears in America?
Sure. So when we put a national name in front of the Orthodox Church, it's somewhat disingenuous. It's that Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism broke ways during the Great Schism in the 11th century. When that happened, Orthodoxy took the approach of each national church is its own autonomous being, all within the unification of what is the Orthodox Church, whereas Rome is everyone's under the Pope, right, and everyone ultimately yields and kneels towards Rome. And so the problem is all of the Orthodox churches have sent missionaries to the United States and started their own churches here. So there technically should be an Orthodox Church of America.
Okay.
But that will probably be another 50, 100 years down the line before that happens, because nothing happens fast in the church.
Mm-hmm. One more question.
Yeah.
So just for my own clarification, accepting where the Pope is involved, do Orthodox and Catholic doctrines kind of run parallel apart from the papacy?
Very, very similar.
Okay.
There are fundamental differences in, say, maybe the way that we define iconography versus statues, or where we define, like we have a married priesthood, or we would have, we see the priesthood slightly different. We don't, for example, the Roman Catholics have the theology of that the priest is sort of a alter Christ, another Christ, that they stand in persona Christi. When they are at the altar, they are functioning as Jesus. Where we in the Orthodox Church look at it much more like Christ works through the priest, but in a fundamentally different way. It's beautifully the difference between Eastern and Western everything. Eastern and Western philosophy is just fundamentally different, and so for the Eastern Orthodox Church, everything is much more about mysticism, and things aren't as finite as they are. And so, Orthodoxy has not gone through like a Second Vatican Council or anything like that. And so in many ways, when you walk in, it feels much more ancient and unique in that sense. And that, I think, having spent so much time on the fringe in the early years of my ministry, there became this sort of intoxicating seduction of validation. And because it was very fatiguing being on 100% the other side of everything for so long. And just and so when the opportunity presented itself, I went for it. And I think probably one of the things that I learned going through that entire process of becoming a priest and watching myself begin to change and watching myself become more rigid and distant and not anymore the person that I once was, I started looking around and I was hurting people in the same way that I had been hurt. I was putting the same rules on them that had damaged me. And all of a sudden, and you start justifying it, kind of like how a parent says, I'm never going to spank my kids, and then they have a kid and he's 5 and he touches the stove or almost runs out in the street, and then they start spanking their kid, and the thing that they would never do, right. And here I was sort of growing older in the church, and all of a sudden I'm like, emotionally grabbing parishioners by the throat and being like, why are you this way? And then sort of mentally justifying it. And I'm like, oh, well, when I was younger, I thought that the best way to help people was this way. But really now that, my bishop is telling me this is, and all of a sudden I was leaving this sort of toxic trail of hurt people, and their complaints were the same complaints that I had being in the church. And so I really had to emotionally grapple with, you ever see the movie Hook? And Wendy walks in and she looks at Peter and she says, oh no, Peter, you've become a pirate. I become a pirate. I didn't mean to. In my mind, I was still some lost boy running out there believing and hoping and having this vision for the future in this wonderful world. But no, I was just out there blowing shit up in the ocean, and I didn't mean to get that way. I don't know how. I can't look back and go, this is the moment that all of a sudden I became a rigid, priest that was more concerned about the liturgy flowing perfectly versus getting out there and doing what needed to be done. But it just happened. And
I feel like I've said this to Daniel before, like people who are like crusading for something or pursuing justice in the world, I feel like kind of to flip that famous line from The Dark Knight a few years back where they said you either die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain.
Right.
I was like, you can rephrase that as, are you into comic book characters?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Okay, so you either die Batman or you live long enough to become the Punisher, where you're just headshotting problems instead of trying to invoke justice in some way.
Sure. And I think that's very true. And, and I mean, we can think of people who, we admire that marched with Dr. King, or were recorded with John Lennon, or any of these people that we think of as these, perfect examples, even though they are certainly imperfect people. We think of them; they become idols in our culture of peace and love and whatever. And then we look at the people who lived. Man, they're sort of wacky. I wish they would shut up. And it's like, we probably would feel the exact same way if they had lived on, and we'd like to think that they would have just remained these perfect examples of social justice, but the world just sort of moves around us. And I guess that was sort of what led to my breakdown, that when I left the priesthood, was I had sort of been straddling this line where I was obeying the church as far as its rules pertaining to marriage equality, and I was not performing marriages for same-sex couples, but I had tons of same-sex couples or individual that were going to my church, and right. So I was sort of living this double life of, we love you and we accept you all the way up to here. This sort of separate but equal mentality. You can absolutely come to our church. We love you. I mean, if you adopt a baby, we can't baptize it. And if you guys decide that you want to get married, you can't, And so then all of a sudden, what do you do with that? What do you do with that, with practical reality, And so, yeah. You
want to jump in here, Dan?
Yeah.
Get on mic.
No, I just want to chime in real quick.
Yeah.
It's just purely because I have a question. I was born and raised Southern Baptist. The hellfire, you're going to hell no matter what. I have a lot of my own thoughts now. I go to a non-denominational church with my wife. A little bit more open, but still not a lot.
Right.
I keep a lot of my own opinions to myself just because I want to keep that. All right, so 2 gay men adopt a baby.
Yeah.
They go to your church. Why can't the baby be baptized?
Well, the Orthodox philosophy would be that in order for a baby to be baptized, their parents have to be a member of the church. And they would not be able to be members of the church if they were practicing, in their life, being themselves. And so when you follow these things out to their completion, that means funerals.
No ifs, ands, or buts.
I mean, there's no. It's where it's where grace and love collide with the law, and it was this moment where I rode that all the way out. I walked along that fence all the way up to DOMA being overturned. And that was the day. That was the day I left. Because, the clergy have message groups and whatever that we were all a part of, where we could go in and discuss, clergy stuff and whatever. And I just remember the day that DOMA was overturned. I mean, both publicly and in these private groups, clergy were just, these priests were coming out. Oh, they're going to ruin America. I wish they would just all kill themselves. They're just, they're going to bring God's judgment on us all. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, and all of a sudden it was like everything clicked in my head. And I realized, here I am working with folks who are homeless, many of which, because they're gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, any other shade of the spectrum, and they've been ostracized. But then I'm part of the system that is ostracizing them. I'm living in that, and this. A couple of weeks before that happened, I had this big breakthrough where I was standing in I went and visited this plantation, and I was walking through the slave cabins on this plantation, and inside they had this plaque that had a sermon written on it. This little cabin was where the slaves had to go to church because they couldn't even go to church with the white folks. And it was a sermon that had been written by a white preacher to be preached by the black preacher, explaining to the slaves biblically why it was a good thing that they were slaves.
Wow.
And I was reading it.
And where was this again? I apologize.
It was in Charleston, South Carolina. And I was reading it, and I was just floored. But then I started looking at the verses. And the verses were right. Nothing was taken out of context. Slaves, obey your masters. You know, like all of this, and it was all there. And I sat there and I went, yeah, and that's New Testament. So it met 100% of the ideological smell test of what carries over from the Old Testament into the New. So theologically, this preacher was not wrong, because slavery was taught about in the Old Testament and it was taught about in the New Testament. And I went, now we have rejected slavery rightly as a society.
Of course.
And the churches that were once the ones pushing slavery turned the ship completely around and became the voice pieces for ending slavery. And I went, can I logically look at this and say that there is any difference in using the Old Testament and some of these obscure New Testament verses to justify the oppression of women, condemning homosexuality, all this stuff? At what point are these sermons going to be sitting in a museum somewhere, and hundreds of years down the line people are going to be laughing and going, remember when Christianity used to...
I can't believe they used to believe that.
Right, you know?
Well, and this is something I say very often. I don't know how accurate it is. It was something somebody told me that I've repeated 1,000 times, so like don't quote me on it. But my big thing, I'm recently married.
Mm-hmm.
I never thought I was going to get married, and then all of a sudden it happened. Divorce.
Right.
Is so bad in the Bible. It's the worst.
Sure.
But my gay friend can't be gay and be okay.
Right.
That's like, what, 48%, 49% that actually stay together? I want to say it's 50. It's above 50% that get divorced every time.
It's bigger than that. It's that now these churches that... Baptist churches used to be you couldn't be a minister if you were divorced. You couldn't do any of this. You couldn't even participate in church. And now they have divorced couple or divorced mingles groups at church where you go and you meet other.
But I promise
people.
you, they don't have a gay mingle group.
But they will in 50 years because the
I
church.
hope you're right.
Because
I don't know if I have that kind of faith in Christianity. Like I really hope you're right.
We shift because I believe that it was always supposed to be a fluid conversation. It was never supposed to be this closed, thing. And even if you look back at the types of things that were being addressed at the time, there's so much ambiguity on these verses. Weren't talking about two consensual, loving people wanting to start a life together. They were condemning temple sex slavery or those sorts of things. They weren't talking about two guys walking into a coffee shop and connecting eyes and deciding they wanted to build a family together and buy houses together. That's not what's being talked about in the Bible. And so I'm sitting there dealing with that all hitting my brain, and then DOMA happens. DOMA's overturned, and these clergy just...
For an ignorant person like myself, what's DOMA?
So DOMA was the Defense of Marriage Act that was actually signed by, interestingly enough, Bill Clinton. And it basically is what... Right. It's basically what defined, this is marriage and not, one man, one woman, legally, that is all that it will ever be. And it had that key component had to be overturned in order for states to have the opportunity to make their own decision. And so so that got overturned, and it just sort of culturally shifted for the church. And the bishops in the Orthodox Church issued a statement, condemning that being overturned and all that kind of stuff, which they had zero canonical right to do, and all this. And it was just this mess. And I just sit there and I was like, how did I get here? Why am I here? What? I did this because I was standing in a park hanging out with people who were ostracized and unloved and uncared about and forgotten. And I'm sitting in Columbia, South Carolina, transferred to this Russian-speaking church. My beard is almost down to my balls, and I'm sitting here wearing 100 pounds of black fabric, and I can't remember the last time I bathed because I don't want to be vain. You used to be sexy, and I'm sitting there like, what am I, and how did I get here, and all of a sudden I was just like, I can't do this anymore.
You just not want to?
I just couldn't do it anymore, and I was like, I'm done. I am done. And it was such a weird experience because I had spent almost a decade at this point in the priesthood, and it was like I had no idea what I was going to do with the rest of my life. This is what I had now taken the trajectory of my life to be, but I just wrote something up and said, I'm done. And I don't know how I thought the church was going to react, but they pulled out all the stops. They definitely,
Like, pulled out all the stuff trying to keep you?
Trying to make sure that I went away as absolutely quick as possible.
I can see myself getting kicked out of a church. That sounds about right.
There was a monastery in New York, and they took all those little monks off of praying duty to hop onto Facebook to start writing literally every single person on my friends list, telling them that I was a heretic and they needed to unfriend me. Like, they did everything that they could.
What's the name of this church? I'll ruin them. Right? I literally, I know people.
Well, if you really want to mess with the Russians right now, you can have fun with it.
I'm always welcome to a challenge. All right, I'm gonna let Steve jump back on here. He's a better personality, but
No, and Dan, you didn't have to leave. I think he's in the bathroom now. So yeah, we're good.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's that was an interesting time because that was the year I was getting married, so I was I was in this bizarre frame of mind, just getting ready for a life change, and then all the these huge cultural milestones started happening, and that was when you popped back on my radar. Actually,
right?
It was that summer, and it was out of nowhere. It was very little press, and then boom, marriage equality happened.
Right.
And that was the same summer that marriage equality, Confederate flag became a big issue. That hit at once.
Yeah, everything just sort of, justice comes in waves.
Mm-hmm.
And that, it was like once people broke through, it was just like the pus of injustice just came out, and it was like there was all of this shit that we had not dealt with as a society yet.
Right.
And it was like, America, here is your life and all of the stuff that still needs to be talked about, And I was living in Columbia, South Carolina, right down the street from the flag. I wish I could remember her name. The lady that climbed up the flagpole and took the Confederate flag. I had already been out of Columbia at the time, but I have seen that flag. That was actually the first thing when they transferred me to that church in Columbia, South Carolina. I remember pulling into the city and seeing that flag flying. It was huge. And I just went, I am in the wrong town. I am not supposed to be here, and
Now, did you feel that way in Pensacola? Because, like, the city of Five Flags, there had been
sure.
a Confederate flag flying on most government buildings for a long time. Like, had this been
Pensacola was a huge culture shock.
so had that been on your mind before you went to Columbia? I mean,
Oh
because-
yeah. What's so funny is people have oftentimes accused me of jumping on issues, you know. But I mean, you can ask any of my family members. I've always been opposed to the Confederate flag, always.
Yeah, because it's
And-
not just you. Like, most
Right.
people, you know, once the door was open for that
Sure.
conversation, most people had pretty well-defined opinions on it.
Yeah, absolutely.
It just hadn't been, like, convenient for society or whatever you want to say. It just hadn't
Right.
been a topic in a while.
Yeah, and you know, me and my buddies, I mean, we used to drive around and steal and burn Confederate flags when we were, you know, kids, you know, and stuff. And so I mean, we were, you know, it wasn't something that was new to me. It was that as soon as that thing got its day to come down, I was like, I am so ready.
Yeah.
You know, I was so excited about it. But yeah, well, from the time when I got thrown out of City Hall.
Your moment with City Hall has to be, like, one of my favorite moments out of your career. Not just, I know that it was talked about a lot, but it was also just so cool to see you, like, basically filibuster City Hall and use your time. Like,
Yeah, well,
that was cool.
One of the things that is so funny, because again, that becomes this moment that I guess stands alone in time, that people miss, I think, the bigger picture of what was happening in that moment. Occupy Pensacola was taking place during that time, and there was this huge sort of City Hall battle going on about whether or not folks could camp outside and where they could camp outside and all that stuff. And these ordinances were brought forward. There were 4 of them that were addressing 4 different elements of homelessness: public camping, public use of restrooms, panhandling, and something else. My brain slips on it. But anyways, they sort of were going after all of this stuff. And so on Mondays, they have a city council meeting where everything is sort of decided, what's going to go on the agenda. They were talking about, you know, how they're going to vote and all this kinds of stuff. And so probably about, you know, 40, 50 of us went to City Hall to talk about these ordinances. And one by one, as people got up to speak, the council president at the time just started throwing them out of City Hall and accusing them of being incendiary and causing problems and all this kind of stuff. And they were just trying to express their concerns, but it wasn't going with what the council president wanted to talk about. And so they were just getting kicked out. And I'd been going to City Hall for years and years by this point, and I had never seen somebody get kicked out of City Hall. And they were legitimately attempting to shut down the conversation on these ordinances and just push them through. So I went to go speak that night at the regular city council meeting on Thursday night and sort of condemn the fact that people were being thrown out of City Hall. But it was all tied in into these homeless ordinances. And I remember when that happened, the local media didn't cover it. It was sort of this just weird thing that happened. And then somebody had swiped the video and wrote, this guy who was running a blog at the time, just put it up on his blog and put the video on YouTube and put the YouTube video in his blog and put it up on Facebook. And all of a sudden, I just started getting all these emails and all of these text messages. And I checked my email, and I had a request to go on Fox News and CNN and all this stuff. And interestingly enough, the guy who wrote me to go on Fox News, they invited me to go on Judge Napolitano's show. And the guy who wrote me was working for Judge Napolitano at the time, a little-known political figure by the name of Austin Peterson. who later went on to run for president on the Libertarian ticket. And so, anyways,
Those poor libertarians.
yeah, and he did pretty good for himself, and he and I still stay in touch to this day after having met through that experience. But
That's really cool.
but it's just one of those things that the exposure went from very limited to just all of a sudden kind of being everywhere and being in the middle of this huge battle with City Hall and people trying to get the council president removed and all this kind of stuff. And what a lot of people don't know is the city council takes like a month and a half hiatus in the winter, or they did at the time. And so they this all happened right before that event. So it drug this drama out for a really long amount of time. The media just locally ended up eating it up, and it was just all over the place. And I remember after that, I sort of disappeared for a minute out of the public eye. The church knew and was aware that I was having some issues with how things were going, and it was really interesting because then the marriage equality issue came up, and I left the church, and then it was like I got thrown right back out into the heat of everything, and so yeah, I mean, those are sort of the things that all kind of brought me to and spit me out on the other side of here.
Yeah, because I remember, let's see, Occupy Pensacola, that was 2012, 2013, somewhere in there.
When was Occupy? I guess it was, I want to say Occupy was 2011, maybe? Is that right?
Ooh.
That's right.
I moved here in 11, and I want to say I've been here at least a year, maybe 2, when Occupy Pensacola happened.
Let's look real quick. We can
See
utilize the Google.
I moved here in fall of 11, so I'd say it's 12 at the earliest.
See, my benchmark for that was actually The Dark Knight Rises, because there were rumors they had shot actual Occupy Wall Street protests to put into the film during the Bain riots. And that was my benchmark because that was the summer I was in India.
Yeah, Occupy Wall Street started September 17th, 2011.
Okay. But it made
So
it to
Occupy Pensacola
Pensacola
happened right after that. So
yeah, so about,
which that makes sense time-wise, because then I guess Sam Hall probably kicked me out City Hall, I want to say October or November of that year. And
So I know I can't be heard.
no, get up here. Get here.
Sam Hall. I'm just saying, Sam Hall is a person that kicked you out of City Hall.
it was December 16th, 2011 was when I got,
Gotcha. Because I say all that because it seems like that it's almost like this trajectory of events, like you couldn't help but be involved because there was the Occupy Pensacola.
Sure.
And then comparatively short time, you had marriage equality go into effect.
Sure.
And I'll cut this out if I'm going too far, but like marriage equality was very personal for you because you have a sister who was affected by that.
Yeah. Well, a sister, lots of friends that I care very deeply for that are essentially family. You know, it really forced me to look in the mirror and face my own conscience of, you know, when I get to heaven, if there is a heaven, and I stand in judgment for the life that I have lived, I would much rather say that I loved as completely as possible than that I lived by a bunch of rules that, as we discussed before, kind of seem to ebb and flow throughout the annals of time. And so is it more valuable to genuinely care about people and their own personal goals and happiness and identity, or sort of rigidly stick to the letter of the law? I would much rather err on love than anything else.
Well, and even in the Bible, like Jesus said that. It says, love God, love your neighbor.
Right.
Like they asked him, he said, this is it. Love God, love the people around you.
Sure.
And it's like, if that's the philosophy you're carrying with you, the rest should take care of itself. Like
right.
The church complicates it. And I grew up in the non-denominational church. I was Episcopalian until I was 10, then non-denominational throughout all my formative years. And I have deep issues with a lot of things that go on, mainly what we touched on before with, the church is supposed to be set up as an extension of your family.
Right.
But we only take we treat them like we treat family when everyone's drunk at Thanksgiving and doesn't trust each other.
Right.
It's like that's the wrong side of it, but that's most of what we get. And how do you relate to that now? Like, you've been out of the priesthood for a few years. What is your relationship like with the church as you have all these experiences and you're moving forward into new endeavors, looking back and looking forward? What is your relationship like with not just organized religion, but faith in general? How has that affected you?
Sure. I joke sometimes that I'm the bastard child of my faith, because for me, I was having this conversation earlier with someone that I don't know that right now in my life that I have faith.
Mm-hmm.
Right now my logic is leading me forward. I struggle daily with, when, especially being a priest and the rigidness and rule, and every morning you wake up and you do your morning prayers, and then you do your afternoon prayers, and you do your evening prayers, and you do weekday mass, and you do weekend liturgy, and you do all of these, and everything has this rhyme and this rhythm and this purpose, and you're doing weddings and funerals and baptisms, and you can see in any given day the totality of the cycle of life. You can be doing a baptism in the morning and burying somebody in the evening, and then suddenly having that gone was an emotional and psychological and cultural shock. I mean, I remember realizing once I left the priesthood, I didn't have clothes to wear.
Oh, man, I didn't even thought of that.
I literally have been wearing the same thing for almost a decade, and I had to go shopping for clothing, and it was just like I had to go to the store in my pajamas
Wow.
to buy clothes. And it's not a very popular film, but Superman 2, when
Dean Cain?
Christopher Reeves, when he's faced with this love that he has for Lois Lane, and he decides that he's just going to give up his power and be mortal.
So
and
Gene Hackman is Lex Luthor?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I was a kid.
And so there's this scene where this guy starts this fight at this diner, and he stands up to fight him, and he gets punched in the face and bleeds, and gets the absolute ever-living crap kicked out of him.
I remember that scene.
And all of a sudden he realizes that he's not Superman anymore. And in a very smaller way, I remember just sort of walking in public, and I wasn't a priest anymore. People weren't coming up and asking me questions. They weren't, you'd go to the supermarket and people would come over and be like, I haven't gone to confession in forever, but I've really got all this stuff that's killing me. And I was just walking through the world as a person.
Right.
And that was a weird experience. And then you're perpetually haunted with the fear that is embedded in you through your faith of waking up every day being like, what if I'm wrong? Am I going to go to hell? Am I leading other people to hell? Am I, am I doing something good, or am I doing something bad? It feels right, but are my feelings right? And dealing with that struggle. But then I got called to the emergency room one day because someone had attempted to take their life because of their identity, and I just sat there and I was like, no, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, because this person is living in a society that is basically looking at them as the new lepers and throwing them out and disregarding them, and their pain and their struggle is genuine and real, and their desire just to be able to love and be loved, and it's all genuine. And who are we? Who am I to question that? To question someone else's identity? There's no value in that. And so I think of leaving the priesthood as probably one of the most pivotal moments of my life personally. It forced me to come to terms with who I really was, and what I really believed. And like I said, this whole crazy adventure started purely out of a desire to help people.
Right.
And I followed some paths that took me into some weird places in the process of that. But one of those paths I took me off of the main course, and that was just to care and love people. And I didn't need a collar to do that. I didn't need validation. I didn't need some bishop smearing oil on my head to care about people. I just needed to care about people.
Yeah.
And so that's what I hope to do, and hope to continue to do. And when I left the priesthood, the very first thing that I did was I spent the entire day on the telephone calling and apologizing to literally every person that I knew that was gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, everything in between. I just called every friend that I had. I said, I am so sorry that I didn't speak up for you sooner. And I'm so sorry that if anything that I said or done has made you feel unloved or unwelcomed or less than. It was, and I had to have some really hard conversations that day. Hearing people tell me, openly ways that I had hurt them. I mean, a friend of mine that I love deeply, and I had told him that I couldn't do his wedding. And hearing how that made him feel, but then coming to terms with the fact that whatever shame or embarrassment that I felt will never compare, even in a fraction, to the things that these folks were going through in their day-to-day life, because of this religious system of oppression that they were living under. And so I genuinely, every single day, consider myself so lucky that I still have those friends and that I've made new friends, because they had absolutely no reason whatsoever to love me back. They could have easily looked at me as a suspect person and rejected me, and instead I have been welcomed in with loving arms into this community of people, and I consider it a real honor that I cherish, and part of that, what I have learned in this process, is that is a fluid conversation. That is not something that when I have to constantly check myself and make sure. I made a joke one time, it didn't feel very off color or whatever, but some of my friends just started writing me publicly and privately and said, that really hurt what you said, and I don't think you're looking at it from this angle. And just instead of getting angry and being like, hey, I was just making a joke, I said, and I listened. And when you take the time to listen to people,
right,
And instead of be offended or say, oh, well, I was just trying to be funny, or I was just trying to do this, or why can't you just, no, just shut up, white boy, and listen to the world that's happening around you, and realize that even the horrible things that I've gone through, the first shelter that I ran, I went and picked up this family in the middle of this dilapidated side of town. They had never had money, and they had grown up in this poverty their entire life. And so even the experiences of poverty that I had and homelessness that I had, there was still a rope to grab on for me.
Right.
I still had my privilege to stand on, because once I got out of the dysfunction, I was able to make it work, and so everything in life has to be taken and looked at in its proper perspective. And it's so difficult to do, because we live in this culture now of perpetual offense, and instead I think it's sometimes important to just turn our swords into plowshares, and just, instead of jumping into the fight and trying to win, sometimes there's a real beauty in surrender and looking back and going, I felt like this was important to me, or that but when you sit back and you listen to someone's genuine pain, how can you argue with that, And
yeah, well, I look at it in the context of every time I approach anything remotely resembling an argument, in my head I say to myself, is this the hill you want to die on? Like, at one point are we resolving this issue, and at what point am I like just stoking a fire for the sake of my own ego?
Sure.
And that's been something I've been trying to really call myself out on inwardly. Like, every time, whether it's with friends or with Annie or whoever, we get that little bit of friction. I'm just like, this is not
Sure.
the time nor the place nor the emotional state of mind. And Dan, were you saying to jump in?
No.
Oh,
I
okay.
was just listening.
Okay.
Freshly married, picking my battles a lot, so I just resonated with that very well. I'm like, oh yeah.
Yeah.
Stoke the fire.
Yeah, because it's
probably more often than I should.
Because like I'm the sort of person I turn into a Spock when I'm arguing with someone, and I lose all humanity, and I'm just like I don't care what you're feeling. Like, this is logic here. Have at it,
Right.
And that's so easy to do, and it's so unfair to the people you're talking with. And do you see yourself, Nathan, now as you're not formally a priest in the church, but you still feel like you have, for lack of better terms, a flock of some sort, that because you're still a thought leader locally, and I'm not sure what kind of national reach you have right now, because to be honest, I have been following you as closely as I'd like lately. But do you still feel a responsibility, like as a thought leader, as a spokesperson, to be, and I hate to keep using the language of the church, but in somewhat of a pastoral role in a way, because people are still seeking you out, people are still asking for your opinion? Like, how do you relate to that now?
I look at this phase of my life as a constant act of apology. Fully well knowing that there are many people who will never accept that apology, and I don't fault them for it. But instead of trying to be rigid or teach anything, what I am doing now is learning again, listening to people, and then now chronicling not my absolutes, but what I'm learning, and regurgitating that back out into the world. So if for some people it's valuable to them to think of me in a pastoral role, then if that's what they need and that's what they see in me or whatever, I don't correct or fault them for that. I have zero desire to ever start another church again. When I think back on that experience, though there were certainly beautiful moments, I don't think I was cut out for pastoral life. I think that I could even argue that it was a mistake for me to have been a pastor. But that's also okay. That that wasn't my niche, and I'm not doing it anymore. But that being said, I guess from a platform perspective, there are people who follow and listen to what I have to say, but I don't think of them as followers or a flock or whatever. I think of them as friends. I mean, if people reach out to me, it's sometimes hard to keep up with all of the messages and whatever, but as best I can, I'm always willing to listen. I'm always willing to, if somebody sees me out in public and wants to spark up a conversation, I want to have it, because I just want to continue to learn, because I spent so much time being right and certain, and now I'm so uncertain that I would just much rather hear people's experiences, and then, like I said, I just turn around and explain through social media and other platforms what I'm feeling, and not in a finite way, not in an absolute way, but just this is what it felt like today, and sometimes that day feels really, really good, and I had great conversations and life was good and it reminded me of these happy things, and sometimes it's hey guys, I'm lying in bed today and I don't even want to get up, and I'm truly in just the throes of depression, because that's something I struggle with, and I just tell that story. And living in that freedom now to be able to talk about those things without the fear of a bishop getting mad at me or any of that kind of stuff, it's very liberating. And so, no, I'm not a pastor. I don't think of myself that way. But I also understand that, like I said, for some people they do, and if that's what they need, then I hope that in whatever limited way I am, I hope I'm able to fill that for them.
Yeah, well, I just know a lot of people look up to you, and rightly so. And you talk about fluid conversations, fluid positions on things, and we're all just people, and you've changed over time. People change over, positions change over time.
Sure.
And I definitely understand how you would come to a position where you feel like you're in a position of apology, like you were saying. But by the same token, the honesty with which you present yourself and your opinions is, even though you're coming to it from a position of apology, that's the kind of honesty and the vulnerability that is very deficient in the church, where it should be presented, as I firmly feel that that's what Christ taught, was that kind of honesty, and it's hard to find. So it's really a really fantastic thing that you've taken on that role as people are still seeking your opinions, that you are that honest, that you are that vulnerable. And I don't know, I just enjoy seeing someone like you who is completely committed to their ideals. And I know you've taken a long journey, and but even when you were wearing your robes, I always thought you were kind of like the rock and roll priest in town.
Right.
So I would see your linen shades, and I would see you causing trouble, and it just always made me smile to know that you were doing that.
Well, and what's funny about it all is, I was living in both worlds. I was living in the world of being a priest, but I was also trying desperately to relate to this world that I thought was hurting, and trying to show them this love that I felt was this tangible doctrine that could be obtained. And the reality is, we're all broken.
Yeah.
We've all been hurt. We've all been, we've all just been hurt in some way, shape, or form. And these priests, I remember standing behind the iconostasius in church, the icon screen that separates the clergy from the nave and all of it. And I'd be standing back there, and these sons of bitches would be sitting there texting gossip to each other in between liturgy. And I'm sitting there, I'm like, you would freak out on one of your parishioners if they had their cell phone out in the middle of liturgy. And you guys are just sitting here, complaining about, this other priest on the other side of the country because you didn't like the way that he wore his, special outfit and all this. Yeah. And I'm like, come on. Yeah. Why can't we just admit that we're all struggling, imperfect people who are trying to make the best out of life and stop regulating everybody else? And that's I guess that's the biggest thing. And the biggest struggle is if you're trying to be perfect, you got to keep up that lie. And it's not an easy lie to keep up.
Yeah. Well, before we go, I think it's about time to pull this train into the station. But you've written a book. I just want to not to be advertising, but I do want to reference it. I do want to plug it here. You've written your memoir about childhood homelessness, Chasing the Mouse, and you brought a copy over here tonight. Thank you for that, and I hope I can get you to inscribe it before you leave. But so when did this come out? It's been a year or 2 years at this point.
It came out in October 2015.
Okay.
And we can end on this note.
Yeah.
That I had an experience. I was running a shelter, a cold weather shelter here in town, and I had this beautiful experience helping a family there, and I just got in the car and I broke down and cried the whole way home because I had to hold it in, there in the moment. Because I'm promising these kids, everything's going to be fine. I can't be the grown-up who sits there and bawls his eyes out, right? So my ex-wife told me when I got home, she said, you really need to start writing some of these things down. And so I did. And my bratty daughter went and told my parents that I was writing a book. And I wasn't writing a book. I was just sort of writing out my thoughts and dealing with my own emotions and whatever. And so my mom called me and she's like, "Are you writing a book about us being homeless?" And I was like, "Well," and she's like, "You can't do that." And I was like, "Well, I am now," and so my parents kind of went into panic mode because they didn't, I do have a little bit of a reputation of being a troublemaker from time to time, and my parents are very keenly aware of that. And I think they were rightfully a little bit nervous about the frame in which I was gonna put all of this. And I came to this realization. I told my parents and my siblings, I said, I don't want to talk about our experience of homelessness with any of you while I'm writing this book. I'm going to write this book for 100% from my perspective of what it felt like to me in that moment. So it wasn't until I got the proof of the book that I let my parents read it. And I remember I drove over to their house, and I had a proof for my dad and for my mom. And I brought it over, and I handed it to them, and I said, "All right, I want you to know that there's going to be things in this book that you're not going to like. You're probably going to learn a couple of things about me that you didn't know, but this is what it felt like for me." And I played a song from the Broadway musical Aladdin called "Proud of Your Boy." And I left them there with the book. And I said, "I'll talk to you guys whenever you're done reading it." And my dad apparently stayed up all night that night reading the book. And he was the one I was most nervous about because I probably gave him the hardest time of it all. And he called me and he said, I read the book. There were things in it that were very hard to read. And there were things that I didn't like. But I won't argue with any of it. And I remember that was just like this huge healing experience for me with my dad, because we had lived this life of the whole, it was all cloak and dagger and hiding and pretending, and then now there it was, just all out in the open for anyone to consume. And I remember thinking in that moment, I was like, if nobody ever reads this book, it has all been worth it to be here right now. And not to give too much away, but I lived. I don't die in the book, and my dad had kind of made all these promises during our experience of homelessness that one day we would end up going to Disney World once everything got better. That was kind of the thing, And so years later, I was at Disney myself, and this woman comes running up to me, and she goes, "Are you Nathan Monk?" I am. And she was like, "I bought your book." And she's like, and I read it, and it's why we're here right now, is because I realized that we needed to stop putting off all of the promises that we were making to our kids, and we just had to do it.
Wow.
And I was just like, like in the middle of the part, just, break down crying, and it was just like, that's why telling your story, I think, is so important, no matter what medium you do it in, whether you write a book, whether you just write in your journal and leave it there for the rest of the world to find later, whatever it is, you tweets, social media, your blog, Facebook, whatever it is, tell your story, get it out there, because your story matters, and you are valuable, and your experiences are valuable, and people need to hear it. And if you're not at the point where you can share it yet, just hold on to those memories and hold on to those experiences, because one day you're going to be sitting in a park with a homeless guy, or you're going to be walking through Disney World, or picking up a homeless family, or doing whatever it is that you're going to be doing, and those stories will be there ready as tools in your tool chest to be able to help and affect somebody else's life who's lived a similar experience as yours. And so just whatever you do, just share your stories.
Cool. I feel like that's a good place to end it here. Daniel?
Can I chime in?
Jump in here.
Second?
Get in here.
Is it an ending moment?
Jump in.
No, Nathan, I just want to tell you how much I've appreciated, honestly, more than anything, just the honesty, the camaraderie of just, I'm a very open guy, and I feel like you are too. So I want to throw this out there. I literally I love being around new people, talking about new things. There's no schedule to it, hanging out, doing whatever. I like having people over, like literally barbecuing, whatever it is, having a good time, just talking, and like great conversation. I've become a very self-educated person, and like I've become way more educated at the age of 25 by meeting people that are very interesting. Please give Steven obviously has your phone number. Like, I will get it, text you. Like, let's hang out. Let's do something and just hang out and just like get around and just have conversations that like just better everyone. But I really enjoyed this as a whole, and I want to tell you, like, you're a fantastic individual, very interesting, and like there's so many people that want to hear this. Very, very glad I was here to like hear it in person.
I appreciate that. I really do.
And segue to Steve.
Well, and if y'all end up barbecuing, you better invite me.
That's right. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
that's
That's a
no-brainer.
prerequisite. That was
That's no-brainer.
an understood. That was an understood.
All right. Well, guys, on that note, Nathan, it's been a privilege to have you on tonight, and I look forward to seeing you around downtown as we tend to do, and also hope to spend some more like one-on-one time with you and Dan, hopefully around a grill or something in the very near future. So
Sure. And we can bring the microphones if we have to.
yeah, and you need to start your own podcast, but that's its own conversation. But again, thank you so much for being here tonight, and again, everybody follow the Father Nathan. Where can they find you online?
You can find me on pretty much every social media, just the / Father Nathan, and I'm on Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram, etc. And yeah, this is always the easiest way to find me.
And Chasing the Mouse is on Amazon, so get that. Anyway, thanks again, Nathan. It's always a pleasure. Hope to talk to you again soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me on.
Michigan,